right on the set.
Okay, so it's been
A long time.
too long. It's been weeks.
Right.
Everybody's been sick. Everybody's been out of town. Everybody's been doing things.
Jet setting.
Yeah. So welcome to Talking in the Chasm, compassionate, controversial conversation between best friends, holy man.
And an atheist. I'm Matthew.
And I'm Felix.
Welcome back.
Yes. Welcome. So let's introduce your coffee cup. This is a good one, huh?
This is a good one. This is, my son got this cup. It's his outlaw cup, I guess.
Your son, like that narrows it down to about 5? Or
The old
6?
one, Elijah. Elijah got it. He likes it.
Nice.
Well, I used to have another one.
Is that a gun barrel?
No. Well, oh, maybe it is.
Yeah.
I thought it was a pipe, but I think it is a gun. It's not very consistent
Elijah.
with our ethics, is it?
No.
They're slipping. The little ones are slipping.
All right. Time for a new coffee cup. All right. So I'm going to be doing a little bit of coughing throughout.
We've been sick, so that happens.
You're not supposed to cough into your hand. You're supposed
Always
to
in
cough
the
like
elbow.
this. And one of the disabled people that I work with, he's like Dracula.
Right, there you go.
Isn't that great? So that's you get a cough like Dracula. But I just wore this.
So then you get.
I just go. Right.
There you go.
That's what it is. It's a cough catcher. All right, so what are we talking about today? Because I honestly I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure I do either.
Okay.
What happened was I sent you a text message the other day talking about how the Apostle Paul was the rationale in the West for the concept of the individual.
Right.
And you were like, what about all the slavery stuff and the killing people stuff?
Because the quote mentioned slavery, or you did. I mean, there was something about how he said that all men are equal. Everybody's equal, and I was like, well, what about the Old Testament God who said that women were chattel and slaves and everything was all property, and that just doesn't seem to square. And then it occurred to me that you could maybe say that the New Testament is sort of a big apology for the Old Testament.
That's right.
Like it was a bunch of.
That's the idea we were talking about.
Yeah.
So
is the New Testament damage control for the Old Testament?
Right. Is Jesus fixing God's reputation?
Yeah.
The book that I'm reading is this one. It looks washed out there. Paul Among the People, and I don't have a review for it yet. I just started it. But what's fascinating, so this lady, Sarah Rudin, what she said is, Paul has a reputation for being like the misogynist of the New Testament. Like, he's really hard for people to deal with. He says things like, let your women keep silent in the church. They should learn in subjection with all gravity. If they have any questions, they should ask their husbands when they come home. Like, he's typically viewed in contemporary Christianity as the misogynist of the New Testament. And so he's kind of out in the woodshed.
So he was an apostle?
He was one of...
So, I mean, but that in that time period that we're talking about, wasn't that just sort of the run of the consensus? I mean, women were certainly not, they didn't vote, they weren't considered citizens, they weren't, you as far as listening to your husband, what was that radical that Paul said that, or was that just how life was? And we look back on it with today's perspective and think, oh my gosh, that's something else.
It's a really complex question. There are certain aspects in which, at least Roman culture, which that's the empire of the day, and Paul makes claims to being a Roman citizen, and he's working in the Roman trade ports, was where he founds his church. So we're considering pagan Roman culture and its interactions with Jewish culture. That's really what Paul's churches are about in large part. And there's certain things that are relatively progressive about gender in the first century among the Romans. Like, for instance, divorce and marriage ideas are pretty egalitarian. Like, a woman can divorce fairly easily. But it's certainly the case that women are in a much lower status position.
Are we talking
socially.
about Rome now?
I'm talking about the Roman Empire broadly.
Because in the Roman Empire, where homosexuality was an accepted part of daily life, and probably transgenderism and other...
Nero marries a 13-year-old boy in a public ceremony.
Right.
So it's not quite as old worldy as we would caricaturize.
But certainly biblically, I mean, the Old Testament for sure, women don't really have much of a say in any of the goings on of the day.
The interesting thing about this...
So how does Paul end up being a misogynist?
Well,
I guess is my question.
The interesting thing about the reason our family, the women, wear head coverings is because of a writing from Paul. So there's this order that's laid out. God is the head of Christ, and Christ is the head of man, and man is the head of the woman. And that's all tied back to the creation order. Adam is created first, then Eve comes from him, and that's a part of the way that God sets up things. Now that, to our ears, I think that sounds misogynistic, that women are derivative of men. But in the context, it's no more degrading for women to come from men than for men to come from Christ or from Christ to come from God. Like that's a...
Yeah, except that, I mean, this is my problem. I feel like that, that Eve came from the rib of Adam is sort of like the first excuse of all of them for why we're going to treat women differently. It's like, okay, so women are less than, starting with this one story. And to say, oh, well, man is less than God, well, okay, I hope so. I mean, to say, oh, God... Christ, man, and women. It's okay for women to be less than men because men are less than God. I mean, that's a little bit extreme to me.
So the point to that passage, and I think this is why this book is interesting to me. Let me rabbit trail a little bit. So in her introduction, what she says is that she was sitting in a Bible study, and there's a passage in one of Paul's letters that he's talking about what's called works of the flesh. They're bad stuff. And one of those is sorcery. It's the Greek word pharmakeia, where we get pharmaceuticals from. But that sorcery is condemned by Paul. And a woman in this liberal church is like, I don't know why he says that. To me, sorcery is just defending your energy and whatever else kind of new agey stuff. And the author says something to the effect of, I would have typically agreed with her, except for I happen to know this instance. She's a Latin and a Greek scholar, studied at Harvard. And she said, I happen to know that in Herodias, there's an event that's described where they would take an 11-year-old boy and bury him up to his neck so that he couldn't move, and then starve him to death with food just inches from his face. And what they thought was that would infuse his marrow with desire. And then they would, after he died of starvation while looking at food, they would take his bone marrow and make love potions out of it. And that's an example that popped into her mind of what sorcery was in the first century. Now, we don't know if that Herodias passage is apocryphal or not, but that's the context in which pharmakeia or sorcery is being talked about.
Wow!
And so when you put
that's
that,
like the most horrible thing I've ever heard in my entire life.
So when you put Paul condemning this, it makes very much sense. And so what's interesting about this particular book, and it's fascinating to read, is that she's squaring what Paul's saying in the context of other first century classical literature, which surprisingly hasn't been done. So when he says pharmakeia, what does he mean? When he says adultery, what does he mean? When he says effeminate, what does it mean? What's the cultural values for those words? And when you put him in the light of his own day and his own era, the things that he's talking about and the things that he's prohibiting are making room for loving, faithful communities of people to respect each other. And from the perspective of the first century, he's quite egalitarian. Now, that's all well and good, but it's also the case, like the quote that I sent you, that his ideas his Christian theology sparks a revolution in the West So the passage that we were talking about there is a small, very small letter that Paul writes. It's known as Philemon. And Philemon is a runaway slave. Now, Paul endorses slavery in certain regards in his letters. He says that slaves should be obedient to their masters. And that masters, this is the real clincher, the real ethical dilemma for Christians looking at first century biblical texts, is that masters should be kind to their slaves. So there's a tacit, at least, endorsement of the institution of slavery. So why should that be? Why, is there any way to rationalize that even in first century morals and ethics? And what does that mean for 21st century Christians, for our first century apostle to have endorsed slavery? Why doesn't he just do what we would expect Jesus to do and say, don't own people, that's bad?
Well, what did Jesus say about slavery?
Well, he doesn't talk about it.
Right.
And there's a lot of things that he doesn't talk about. And so the continuation of the apostles is kind of like Jesus's message going out and becoming a religion. So why should that be? Why should Paul talk about slavery? Well, what I think, the way that I rationalize that is I say the reason for that, I think that Paul's idea is about individualism. So going back full circle, Philemon. So he's already said, slaves be obedient to your masters, masters be obedient to your slaves. Okay, one thing is that...
He said, be good to your slaves, not obedient to your slaves.
Right. Be kind to them. And he does this kind of like, this play on words. He says, for every free man is the Lord's slave, and every slave is God's free man. Like, it's playing with concepts, which is novel. That's really groundbreaking stuff, that you could think of a slave as a free person to God. But more than that, what I think that Paul's doing, because Philemon, he says, Philemon's a runaway slave, and so he becomes a Christian, this runaway slave becomes a Christian, and kind of falls on Paul for protection, like, help me, I ran away, they're going to kill me. And Paul writes to his owner, his slave master, and says, look, I know you, Philemon's with me, he's a Christian, you need to treat each other like brothers and reconcile, and don't treat him ill, take it on my account if he's done any harm or damage to you. So the idea that he's defending a runaway slave is kind of a countercultural notion, but still very regressive from our perspective. But what I think about Paul's utilization and reorienting of the slavery context is that, first of all, I don't think that first century slavery is what we think of, especially as Americans, from American slavery. There's a distinction, and you may want to take exception to this, but there's a distinction between man-stealing and slavery. There was an institution that the Roman Empire was built on that was slavery, where slaves could be very powerful and very wealthy and very influential people. It was a class. It was more like, it was different. It wasn't a racial slavery, for one. Like, it wasn't distinguishable as a racial feature. And that makes it entirely, because you could look at someone who was a slave who was just like you, who was your same color, who was your same, he looked like you, but he was a slave. And so there's not this same kind of othering that happens with slaves. There is certainly a classism that happens with it, and a socioeconomic difference, but slaves could be very, very powerful people in the Roman world, depending on the house that they were a slave in. And there's even, in the Jewish world, there's an institution where a slave can choose to remain in the household. Like, you could only hold a Jewish slave of your own people for a certain amount of time, more like indentured servitude. Like, it was a matter of, you bought somebody like a debt, and they would work for you for 7 years. And at the end of that 7 years, or whatever the time was, there was an institution in the Jewish law where a slave could say, I don't want to leave, I want to stay here. And what I think that expresses is that in the ancient world, to be connected to a household, and especially a wealthy household, meant you were going to eat, and you had food, and it was better for you and for your family to stay a slave in that household than to go out as a freeman and become a peasant and a land slave. So all of these are really complex ideas around slavery that aren't quite as morally clear-cut as we tend to think of, especially given our Civil War history.
I mean, the interesting thing to me about the thing that you said about Paul and the slavery thing is, the Old Testament mentions slaves often as property, and women too. So
does it mention women as property?
There's a passage where it talks about slaves, about victors in a war or something, and they get the slaves. They get slaves, the animals, the chattel, and the women. That's just we're lumping all that together. So, so clearly, if we were just looking at the Old Testament, you're not getting the feeling that all people are equal and that we're going to love and that women are the same. So, there's certainly a disconnect for me when the people say, "Oh, this is the book, this is the word, this is how we're supposed to live." I hope not. There's some serious problems. There's serious problems with the New Testament, but especially with the Old Testament. That dude is that guy was scary.
Well, this is a really big theological concept, and I think it's not very well developed when people talk about the Bible. And what I think is necessary to understand properly what's happening in the Bible is that the Old Testament, from a Christian perspective, from a Jewish perspective, this looks differently, but from a Christian perspective, from a Christian theological perspective, the Old Testament is set up intentionally to be like one of Paul's letters, it's assumed to be one of his letters, in Hebrews, talks about types and shadows. So like God is doing a giant object lesson through the Old Testament. So the establishment of the nation of Israel is what God says is he picks a dude, Abraham, and he says, I'm going to make my people out of you. And your people are going to be my people. I'm going to distinguish one particular people as my own. They're going to be small, they're going to be weak, and their only strength is going to be me. They're not going to be known for all these other things. I'm going to be the reason that they become powerful and mighty. I'm going to lead them into a place that I'm going to show you, and it's going to be yours because I'm going to make you my own. And that unique relationship between Israel and the God of heaven is what the model of what the Old Testament is. And there's all kinds of lessons that happen through that, but they're happening in a very concrete physical way, in a very concrete physical world, which is the old world. And what happens through those object lessons is that God is showing, like what's an example of an object lesson? So the Proverbs is full of object lessons. It says where how does it say? It talks about fire and contention. It says where there's no wood, the fire goes out, and when contention stops, I can't remember. But there's all these object lessons, and all what is happening with Israel is one giant object lesson. God's showing us about his intentions for purity, his intentions for humanity, his intentions for community, his intentions for a whole bunch of stuff, not least of which is the Messiah, who we think was Jesus. Now, so let's just zero in on one of those particular examples. Jerusalem is a city. It's a very concrete, like literally stone city. And that was a place. And God said, this is going to be my city, and this is going to be where King David is going to be, and the throne is going to be established here, and all this stuff is going to happen here. And this nation, Israel, has geopolitical borders, like very well delineated geopolitical borders, like from here to here, and here to here, and here to here, and these are the people that are going to live here. All of that.
Were there already people living there at the moment that was? Yeah, that's the rub, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, which we can talk about. But I want to make the point that geopolitical nation among all the other nations was symbolizing something that God wanted to show. And what he wanted to show was that he had a distinct people who were his own that were going to be different than the rest of the world. And they were going to be different according... So like in Israel, a lot of that is ceremonial. So the way that they sacrifice their monotheism, as opposed to the plural theism that's happening in the nations around them, the idolatry versus God not being represented by an idol, all of this is distinct about Israel, and certain things like their washings, circumcision, all of these distinctives about this particular people came from this relationship to God. Now, what happens in the New Testament, and this is a very controversial thing that Paul himself is dramatically involved in, is that the new church, the people of Jesus, the society that he's making, breaks out of that geopolitical ethno state of Israel and becomes something that's for everyone everywhere. And now, so Old Testament, the nation of God is this walk out the borders in Israel. As the new people of Jesus, the Messiah that was prophesied through all that, now he's going to have very much a distinct people, very much a nation like David had in the Old Testament. But his nation isn't going to be with borders. It's not going to be for a particular ethno-state, for a particular people. It's going to be Chinese Christians, African Christians, American Christians, everybody, everywhere. And that transition from the ethno-state of Israel to all people in all places is a huge controversy. It's one of the first controversies in the new church after it's founded. And this, like, so another...
That's New Testament? Or
right.
Yeah.
That's the difference between the Old Testament and New Testament. These physical things versus spiritual things. So then how do we think of going into Canaan and expelling all the people that live there? That's the immediate question we ask. Like, for instance, one of the famous people who are expelled are called the Amalekites, and there's a command, and it's hard. It's from God to Saul to kill every man, woman, and child of the Amalekites.
Yeah, so this is my... As an atheist, okay,
right.
So basically I don't believe in a soul, I don't believe in an afterlife, I don't believe in a continuation of existence.
So it all sounds like poppycock.
You know, it does. And to say I don't believe in Jesus, I don't believe that he raised the dead, and I don't believe that he died on a cross and you know, performed miracles, well, that's one thing. But I can also say that from the modicum of information that I have on his teachings, I agree with him.
Right.
Okay? I mean, if you believe that he was the Son of God, that's fine. I don't, but that doesn't mean that we disagree on the fact that his lovey, hippie ways were super cool. But the Old Testament, man, I gotta tell you, like, creating these people, drowning them all in a flood, giving Job everything, taking it all away just to test and torture him to see if he's gonna stay faithful. Was it Abraham he said kill your son?
Yes.
Tied him up,
right.
Had the knife to his throat, and he's like, no, yeah, it's fine, you don't have to do. I mean, it's like, it's not only do I not believe in God, I don't want that guy.
Right.
I hope that there's not a God for everyone's sake,
right.
if that's God,
right.
if that's the guy. And I mean, what's the first commandment?
Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength.
Right, it's me. Love me. What's the second one?
Love your neighbors yourself. Well,
no,
okay, not in the Ten Commandments.
Yeah, the Ten
Jesus reorients the two commandments.
But the first one is love me. The second one is don't make an idol. The third one is don't take my name in vain.
Right.
I mean, it's all... Where does it start getting into, like, here's how we should treat each other? I mean, this is a jealous... self-centered, egotistical. He needs you on your knees. I mean, and it's terrifying. It's scary and dark and frightening. And that I have these people are like, oh, this is the word. It says this in the Bible, and I'm going to use this as an excuse to hate gay people, and I'm going to use this as an excuse to beat my wife, and I'm going to use this as, it's like, oh, because it was written in this thing. That's horrible. Right. I mean, it's horrible, and this goes beyond like, oh, atheism and I believe and I don't believe. It's like the framework for generations of evil, of like mistreatment of people, of an acceptance of slavery, for instance. It's okay. And manifest destiny. We can just kill all the Indians on the way to the Pacific Ocean because that's what God said, because we can interpret this in such a way that it says it's okay. that is like I mean, that is beyond like, oh, I don't believe in God. That is like reprehensible, and it's a horror show for me.
I get that, and I know why.
And it seems indefensible.
Well, I think that the indefensibility comes from a lack of understanding. I mean, it's not that I think
unless we're going to word games.
No.
I mean, for you to go, oh well, he didn't really mean kill the firstborn of every single household unless you spray blood on the door of the I mean, what?
The way I think that it makes sense is that imagine, okay, how are you going to start like with Jesus in the 10th century BC? So when you have a bunch of war chieftains, a bunch of pagan war chieftains who happen to be like slaughtering their own children to their gods, like let's think about the people that we're talking about.
You say that as if the Christians didn't do that. I mean, Abraham was tied down with a knife to his throat. I mean,
but
I think we're talking about ancient culture,
right?
And that
this is my point, that Israel is founded as an ancient culture among ancient cultures, and so the idea of establishing nation and warfare is implicit in existing in the old world. It's implicit in existing in the contemporary world. I mean, the fact that there's a people called Christians for 2,000 years now who, at least in subsets, have completely rejected violence. Like, there's a continuing people who've called themselves Christians from the first century. And when the church was strongest, it was the most in line with those teachings.
I love that idea. I don't think that it's very true. I mean, I can't think of a group of Christians that doesn't violence. I mean, you could say, well, maybe Amish people, but I mean, then you read about the wife beatings and the incest and stuff.
Right.
Is it because they're an insular, silent group? We assume that it's fine, but they're not. It's just like everybody else.
Right.
There isn't a Christian group that has been peaceful and loving. I mean, that your family is, and I'm intrigued by that.
Well, I'm a part of a network of communities. For sure, we're a niche, but I think Jesus's people have always been a niche. I think that Christendom, like the civilization that has attached itself to the West through these influential theological ideas, is a different thing than the people who are radical followers of Jesus.
Well, I disagree with Jesus, with Christianity having been a niche, with Jesus' teachings of being a niche. I mean, when we're talking about the Crusaders and the Spaniards, the conquistadors, and going over, taking over the entire world. I mean, that certainly wasn't a niche. They were the power.
But
and right now, it's the power. I mean, you cannot run for the president of the United States and not say you believe in God.
Right.
It doesn't matter what you believe in, you have to say that.
Right.
It's printed on all of our money. There's no separate. I mean, it is the Christianity is the way of this land, the Western world.
Right.
And
I think because of these really powerful dynamic ideas that Jesus teaches and that the apostles continue, but there's a very important pedigree for people who are actually following Jesus. Like, you have to remember that Christianity and the adherents of it were born into a world that they were outlaws. Like, to become baptized in the first century, whether you were in Jerusalem or there's 10 great persecutions in the first 300 years. That means, like, the Roman government is expressly, with no holds barred, trying to stamp out. Nero has Christians hung on crosses in his whole via, driving his chariot up and lighting them, dipping them in wax and lighting them on fire. They're feeding them to lions.
Right, and southern Christians and Baptists are stringing black people up into trees and tying homosexuals to fences and setting them on fire. I mean,
but
people are horrible to each other.
But here's the difference. The Christians who are dying in the early Roman Empire for the first 300 years, when Christianity is an outlaw religion, and spreading like wildfire, like that inconsistency is a very strange thing. That an empire should be trying to kill everyone who gets baptized in Jesus' name, and it's spreading throughout the whole empire, is a really sticky conundrum, like why that should be.
Right.
I think that there's something in the original Jesus movement that was lost, and it was lost, not ironically, through the embracing of power. There's a very specific history that happens in the Roman Empire. The Edict of Milan happens at the beginning of the 4th century when Constantine legalizes Christianity. And not only does he legalize it, within a few decades, he actually becomes the chair of the Council of Nicaea, which is where all the bishops come together to resolve a dispute in the church. Effectively, Christianity is Romanized. And at the Romanization of Christianity, it's taken something entirely different that allows for the establishment of the Roman Catholic Church and the papacy and the power manipulation that calls itself Christian, that feeds itself into the rest of medieval Europe. And the interplay between state and church that happens at the beginning of the 4th century radically redefines what Christianity is. Now, there have been small pockets of those original kind of Jesus followers. The Anabaptists is a big epoch of that. The Waldensians is another. There's little subsets of people who call themselves Christians who are almost always persecuted by the power structures that are in line with the original teachings of Jesus. And that's always who the true Jesus followers have been. And they've always been a small subset. It's the pedigree that we claim, that we're not surprised that we're a small number of people who call themselves Christians, because it's been that way since the 4th century. But there is a difference between people who say, I'm a disciple of Jesus and that means I follow his teachings, and people who say, the ideas of Christianity have changed Western civilization and I'm a de facto part of Western civilization. Like, those are two different ideas. But all that being said, the fact that Western civilization has a concept like the individual, coming out of a world that was all strong group affiliation. This is an anthropological idea, that there is no concept of the individual. You are who your father was. You are who your tribe was. You are who your people were. Now, take that idea, that strong group anthropology, back into the old world. Now, when God says to Saul, kill every man, woman, and child of the Amalekites, he's talking about that world. Well, Jesus can't establish his, at least he didn't for whatever reason, I think because the lesson wasn't made. But if you're going to have an Israel that's a geopolitical, that's a geo state, especially an ethno-geo state, you have to have war. You have to establish your territory. You have to establish your domain, and you have to defend it. And you have to purge out the people that live there. Or that's going to happen to you. Here's the case of the world. In that day, either you're going to kill the Amalekites or they're going to kill you. If it's God's intention to establish a nation within that world, and he's not going to change the world, which I think he does with Jesus, but at that time he didn't. That wasn't the time for that. Then you have to have a nation of Israel who's going to conquer its enemies and have real physical war.
Yeah, I mean, it's just hard not to look at this as the curious 5-year-old that I am and just say, okay, so God makes these people. Uh-huh. He makes these people and they live here, and then he makes these people and he goes, you guys are chosen. You need to go and kill every single man, woman, and child from here. People I also created, but I want you to destroy them. That's insane. I mean, that's insanity. Doesn't that sound crazy to you? That he makes all these people and then just says, okay, you guys are going to go and kill, because if they don't kill you, if you don't kill them, they're going to kill you. That's awful. What? And I imagine trying to explain that to a 5-year-old or to an alien that landed and said, explain to me this religion thing. I don't understand how that works. I'd be like, dude, I don't, neither do I.
I think that my own view...
I mean, the Amalekites were not God's creation?
No, they were.
Okay.
But so is everyone that dies from cancer. So is everyone that gets hit by a bus. So is everyone that... so the problem, the initial problem is that there is a problem. Like, the fact that anybody kills anybody is no different than the fact that the Israelites kill the Amalekites, or that the Amalekites kill the Israelites, or that the Houthis kill the Tutus.
So I for me, what I say is, well, people are are jealous and people are weak and they want what they can't have. They want what you have, and they're just going to take it. I mean, that's what happens, right? And so I can say, okay, well, those people weren't brought up properly, or those people are just angry, or something happened and they want what you have, and they're just going to take it because that's how they are. That, to me, is actually easier to swallow than to say there's a God that's overseeing all this insanity. I mean, just say there's a problem, well, yeah. So there's a problem. And so God says, okay, it's okay to kill these people because of this problem.
Let's take an analogy. I think that I'm not trying to draw, I'm not equalizing this analogy. I'm just using it as an analogy. The elephants were being killed, slaughtered. They were almost endangered. They were going to be gone, lost. And they did all these different things to try to save elephant herds. Couldn't do it. There was too much incentive to poach. Mm-hmm. What they finally did, what seems like it's been the lasting solution, is to put the local people in charge of the elephant herd and let them sell hunting licenses, sell hunting permits. And those hunting permits were very, very valuable. And killing 1 or 2 or 5 or however many elephants a year provided the incentive structure and the income to preserve elephants, plural. And as managers of that wildlife, people said it's better to lose 5 elephants and keep elephants alive than to not have elephants. And so the hunting of elephants preserved elephants. This is the reality. That's an ugly situation. Like, I can sit here in my office and say, I'd just rather people not kill elephants. Why do we got to do that? But they do. That's the state of the world. I think that something like that is how God looked at the old world. He says, I need to create a path for salvation to come through Messiah. I need to establish a lot of really important things about what I want to do, so I have to create a place where I can have a people and a law, and where I can establish what happens when you obey, what happens when you disobey, how does life come, how does death come, how does health come, how does sickness come. I need a place to establish all these things in a multi-generational way. If it's going to happen, it has to have X, Y, and Z. And part of that is well-defined borders, well-defined people, well-defined laws. If that's going to happen in this world, they have to purge out the people that live there, or they're going to be purged. I can't maintain that herd of people in the elephant analogy if we don't do what needs to be done.
I can't maintain. That doesn't sound like an omniscient God to me, or omnipotent.
Well, he could have wiped them out and started over, but we're assuming that...
Yeah, but he did that before with Noah, or was that after?
No, that was before.
I mean, I mean, reading the Bible is, to me, it's like a fast track to atheism. Like the more I read, the more I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, what? But anyway, I want to go back briefly. This is back to where we were talking about the place of women in society. You said that the women in your family cover their heads, and can I put a picture? Should I put a picture of your family?
Yeah,
on
sure.
So I'll put a picture in this.
You've taken
some
pictures.
I've taken some pictures, and they're just beautiful, lovely people, and it's so cool, and I love your whole look. But what's interesting to me is that the Erica was the one that said she read this passage in the Bible that made her decide she was going to cover her head. It isn't as if you said, "Hey, girls, we're going to do this," right? It's her idea. She said, "Okay, I want to do this." Yeah. Can you tell me again? Because you just briefly said, "Oh, it's the it's the hierarchy that made her want to cover her head." I don't understand. What passage of the Bible, and why did she decide to cover
the text is,
and it's not her face. It's now you'll see the picture, but it's just a
on her head.
A head covering.
Yeah, the passage is the first epistle of Corinthians, the first letter to Corinthians in the 11th chapter. And what Paul says there is that there's about 16 verses that are about this particular thing. There are allusions to it in the past. Women covering their heads was a fairly common thing in the ancient world, but the custom for the Christians is it's actually quite countercultural. What's fascinating is that if you look at what's really scandalous and countercultural about Paul's writing to the Corinthians in that passage is that it was the custom for both the Jews and the Romans that men would cover their heads, especially in religious observance. So the high priests had special hats that were
Right.
part of their uniform, and there's a lot of examples, but one in particular is a famous classic statue of Caesar as Pontifex Maximus, because the Caesar was the religious leader too. He was like the Ayatollah of the empire. Right. And there's a famous statue of Caesar as Pontifex Maximus, and he has a covering over his head, just like a shawl. It drapes over his head and over his shoulder, like we would expect, like women would if you look at a Bible coloring book or something. So men used to cover their head, and what covering means...
Well, they covered their heads all up until John F. Kennedy, man, ruined it for everybody.
Did he?
Yeah, he was the first one that...
Oh.
He often went without a hat.
Uncovered, yeah.
In the 60s, everyone was like, whoa, okay. And then hats went out of fashion because he was such a popular
That's funny.
icon.
I didn't recognize how important he was in that.
Anyway.
Anyhow, the idea of covering under religious devotion meant I'm under God. Mm-hmm. So that's why priests in a bunch of different religions would wear something over the head. It's still the case, and even in later Christian traditions.
So Erica read that and said, I'm under God, therefore I'm going to cover my...
Well, what Paul says in that letter is he says men shouldn't do that, and women should. Now, that's kind of a reversal. And his rationale from that is, it's kind of complex, but the basic rationale is that there's an order of creation. Women came from men, like God makes man first and then woman from man. There's a companion nature, like as God makes the world, he makes a man and then he makes a woman as to fill out his world, to make things the way I don't know. It's a long discourse to talk about why, but he does that, and so there's this order of creation that the Christian women were in loyalty to, in allegiance to, by when they pray or prophesize, the two places where they're supposed to do it. He says when a woman prays or prophesies, she should cover her head. And what she's saying is that I'm under God's authority structure. I recognize that there's an order to the world and an order to humanity, and I'm observant of that, and it creates a space supernaturally for her power, for those religious demonstrations, that when she prays, she communicates with God. When she speaks divine truths, it's coming from God, and that's all symbolized by those things. And there's also some mystical elements to it, that angelic, supernatural realities observe these things as well.
Was Erica like, well, if I'm speaking to God, covering my head, well, I'll just cover it all the time, and then I will always be
basically
with God and angels, and
that's why she does.
That's pretty cool.
Kind of all the time. And so that she's always ready. Like when we first started that practice, she would she'd go find something and put it on when she was, like if we were going to sit and pray together, she would go find something and put it on her head. And then it became cumbersome. Like it was like, it'd be way easier if that was just already there, so I don't have to go find it out of the glove box or wherever, my purse. And so that was how we developed our customs. It's kind of utilitarian. I think in the old world, in the first century, it was pretty common to just have a part of a woman's costume, a part of her dress, like a shawl that you could just put on your head when you were praying or prophesying. But, so there's a lot of components to that. It's countercultural in that it's upsetting kind of like the religious order that men are supposed to do that. But there's also a lot of like what we would call pastoral input there. What it means for a woman, for a Christian woman to say, I'm recognizing God's order in the world, what it means for her to consider herself under a man is like what it means for a man to feel like he's under Christ, and it's like what Christ feels like to be under God. And none of those things are from our perspective, oppressive structures. Like, Jesus isn't like, oh, God, he's not like a petulant teenager. He's not like, oh, man, God's my authority. And I don't feel that way about Christ. I'm glad to be under his authority. I receive all kinds of good in my life from considering myself under Christ and under his authority and protection and teaching. This goes to gender roles. I mean, from here we talk a lot about gender roles and what the function of those things is in culture and biology, and that's a whole nother.
Yeah, that's for sure. We'll do that. Separate show just on that, because that's pretty interesting. Just to kind of go back to the slavery thing.
Oh yeah.
I want to. The last show that we did, I believe, was on whether you can separate art from the artist. Is it okay to like Michael Jackson, who was a child abuser? Is it okay to like Thomas Jefferson, even though he owned slaves, right? And
what does it mean for them to be men of their day? Right.
At some point, you excuse reprehensible behavior if that was the norm, if that was how how it all went. And I remember a couple things about growing up in America. The stories that you're told and the what you learn in school. Abraham Lincoln is as close to a god as you can. I mean, he is this just absolute amazing,
folk hero,
right?
at least.
Yeah. And Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. These people are larger than life. And it wasn't until later on that I heard some Abraham Lincoln stories that kind of disturbed me. Like one of them, well, the one amazing story was that he said that he was a child on a steamboat, a little kid, and that he saw a slave for the first time. It was a black man in chains.
Because he was from Indiana.
Yeah.
Or Illinois.
Yeah, so it was on the Mississippi or something.
Yeah.
But he saw a man in chains, and as a child, he was just like, it just seemed so wrong, and he was taken aback, and he didn't understand what was going on, and the whole thing, and he said he kind of carried that with him his whole life, and just to think about that, it just, fundamentally, it feels wrong. It seemed wrong, nothing was explained to him, he had no idea what was going on, but it seemed wrong, okay? And I'm like, wow, that's so cool. But then later on, he says, well, I promise to not interfere with the state's decision to have slavery or not to have slavery. He did what he had to do to become president, and then you assume, well, maybe he
had a secret
kind of
motive,
all along, and then I don't know. But he was a politician,
right?
He's a politician like every other politician.
Right.
He lied, and he said what he had to say. That he had to, scratch this person's back to get this thing done. So that's interesting. But can we forgive Thomas Jefferson? Who wrote the Declaration of Independence and wrote this just beautiful exposition on equality and human rights, when in fact he had slaves.
I
so
think
and in the same way, when we look at the Old Testament, it's like, well, was violence and sacrifice and horror just a part of life? I mean, can we separate?
Something like that is what I think about, certainly about the old world that Israel is a part of, and also about the old world that Paul is a part of. That, so when he says, I think what it is about Paul and his ministry and his teaching is that he says, I don't have to recreate the world for the church to thrive right here, right now. There are ideas that Jesus has taught about humanity that don't have to recreate the whole socioeconomic order in order to work. Like, I don't have to dismantle civilization in order for the church to grow. And that's why there's kind of like this tacit acknowledgement that slavery exists, and here's how we're going to function within this world. And I think there's something like that about Thomas Jefferson. He has certainly ideas about the nobility of the individual and what it means to be a man. He just has a very narrow view of that. And some of that may be some of that certainly is true of Paul. I think there are certain ways that his ideas grew from him and from his teaching that he couldn't have necessarily foreseen.
Right.
I wouldn't be surprised if he foresaw slavery ending from his ideas, but I don't know that he expected it to happen in his lifetime. But what he did for sure want to do, and I think it was noble and notable, is reorient people back into this system. Say, you can't, okay, you have a slave. We live in a world that's bordered by this socioeconomic order of slavery. You can't treat him like he's not a man. You have to recognize that is a person, and even more so in Paul's teachings, you have to recognize that he's your brother. So that's,
yeah.
I think that conditions a lot of those things.
Yeah, and we talked about Christopher Columbus the other day because it was Indigenous Peoples Day, but, and we had both read about some things. And here's a guy who's just absolutely reprehensible. I mean, he came to what he thought was India, landed in the wrong place. Said, okay. He wrote a letter back saying these people are so kind and
docile.
Open and docile that I think with an army of about 50 soldiers we could take over this entire continent. Like, that was his thinking. And then he grabbed a couple of them, he chained them up, brought them back to Spain, and said, here's what they look like. So he's a horrible, horrible person. And it's very hard to go, well, how much of that was the time? How much of that was that his job? I don't know, But I certainly, the more I read about Christopher Columbus, the less I want to celebrate him. I think that, me personally, is just, so it's hard to figure out what is the time period and what was okay because that's the time, and we accept that they were living in a time. It's hard to live in a household filled with slaves and to just come up with the idea that there should be no slaves.
Right.
I mean, it would be great, but it's also hard for us from our vantage point to go back and go, how could you not think that? I mean, you don't know.
Well, imagine what our world would be like if in Boston Commons, like, there's a giant brass statue that they heat up till it's red hot and we lay a few infants in it every 3 weeks. That's intense. Like, that's a world that people were living in. Or the Mayan world where they just cut people's hearts out on.
But part of me thinks, imagine a world where there's a giant mega church and people out there spouting hatred, and then those people go out and then they kill gay people.
Right.
That is the world we live in. I mean, it's not that different. So, but we're gonna get into that. We got a lot. What did we talk about today? I don't even know what to call this. This was an intro to the Old Testament. I don't know.
Paul, the ancient world. How about that?
Okay.
The morals of the ancient world, ethics of the ancients.
We just scratched the surface. There's a lot I need to process, because I'm interested to hear how you can make it all work in your mind. Because I can't make it work. So maybe help me with that.
Okay, we'll try.
All right,
I love you.